Julius. Puts up a three. Yes! And a
Bearcat Blitz. Hope everybody's having a strong start to their week. I know I am. It's getting into another edition of the show right here on the Believe Network. I'm your host, Russ Heltman of Cincinnati Bearcats on SI. He's my co-host, Neil Meyer from Rivals Cincinnati site, thefrontofficenews.com. Check us out on both those mediums after Cincinnati kind of did what they've tended to do this decade and lose to Houston, 73-64. Another game where they fight hard in the series, but just too much talent, too many mistakes for Cincinnati, and too much of a defined time to close out the back half of the first half for Cincinnati to really ultimately pull off any chance of an upset here. They did outscore Houston 39-36 in the second half, but just ultimately nowhere near enough to get the job done on the road for a much-needed quad one win, but a win that they may not necessarily have had to have notched given how poor and how light the NCAA tournament bubble is this season. We'll touch on those first two things to start the show and then get to the latest matchup on deck next against Kansas State, a Kansas State team that has not had its star player over the past few games. Before we do all that, got to tell you about Bet Online, the world's most trusted betting platform and your number one source for online betting in 2025. They are a presenting sponsor, and whether you're a seasoned fan or a first-time bettor, BetOnline is your ultimate game day companion with the largest selection of odds on everything from NBA and college basketball to the NHL and UFC. BetOnline continues to be your number one sports betting source. From every three-pointer to hat trick, BetOnline has you covered with odds, stats, and more for every game, every play, and every win. BetOnline, the game starts here. Neil, a disappointing result on Saturday. UC never had much of a chance to win this game, despite leading 10-9 at one point and fighting hard in the first half of that opening frame. They crumbled down the stretch of that frame. Houston went on a massive, massive run, I believe 14-0 to really slam the door shut there. Neil, this team is, just in my opinion, a score or two short from being able to win these games and a connecting piece of the rotation on the other end away from being able to win these games, because Dan Skillings Jr. was an unmitigated disaster across this one. He played 18 minutes, had 3 points, shot 1 of 4 from the field. And at this point, I would just be telling him, do not do anything around the basketball except go in to rebound it and immediately passing it to a guard. Stick him in the corner. Do not give him any kind of green light to shoot the basketball. All Dan Skillings can really do at this point in his UC career is rebounds, and he was a massive reason why Cincinnati otherwise should have been in position, Neil, to win this basketball game. The guards have so much pressure on them right now, but they still answer the bell with 18 points on 8 of 19 shooting from Jizzle James, and it just unfortunately feels like they wasted one of the best games of Day Thomas's career. 3 rebounds, 8 of 12 shooting for 19 points, just 1 turnover for him and 1 turnover for Jizzle James. They only commit 11 total, but 3 of those from Dan Skillings, Neil. And just those 3 issues, those 3 mistakes alone could have flipped 6 to 7, 8 to 9 points. And what do you have at the end of this one? A 9-point loss. Just in those types of games against these types of teams, Neil, every single portion of the Bearcats rotation has to be somewhat on point to come away with victories that they are 1-10 achieving against quad one opponents this season. And that's been a big reason why, is just not enough connecting pieces in a team that was supposed to be filled with strong depth at every single spot.
Yeah, no, most certainly, Russ. And obviously, as you mentioned, they are 1 scorer away potentially from winning some of these games down in Big 12 play, because if you look at it, Simas Lukosius has been struggling throughout Big 12 play. Obviously, he's dealing with a little bit of a shoulder injury. However, he has not lived up to the expectations that this team thought that he would have had this season, along with Dan Skillings. Those were 2 of your guys entering the season that were expected to play big roles for Cincinnati in that category.
And I also got to shout out Ayrton Page here. He cannot be left off the hook. Another just complete no-show. There has to be a major issue with injury-wise hampering his ability to move because, once again, Neil, less than 5 minutes played, no statistics. I think he had one personal foul, did nothing else, missed his only shot attempts. I mean, he has basically left them with zero backup center options on the roster.
Yeah, most certainly, especially due to the injury of Tyler McKinley earlier in the season. And Russ, I've been saying it all season long, that injury to Tyler McKinley devastated this team, right? If Tyler McKinley's able to go, you not only have your stretch four, you have a backup post player that can give you some valuable minutes there in the front court. And he does a lot of things that guys like AP can't do. And that's Tyler McKinley can shoot the heck out of the ball. Everybody knows that. When he can shoot, we've seen him, Russ, pregame, knock some stuff down from behind the arc, get his pregame workouts in. Now that he's starting to get fully back healthy. But that injury really hurt Cincinnati there in the front court, especially in terms of the development of AP, right? I know Wes Miller and them have really said that they want to develop AP being a sophomore. He really didn't play that much at USC. But Tyler McKinley was a guy who could have came in and made an immediate impact. And then on top of it, you're not getting the production from Dan Skilling, Simas Lukosius as well. Realistically, Russ, they have been predominantly relying on guys like Day Thomas, Jizzle James, Aziz Bandago, Dylan Mitchell over the last few games, that they are really needing to find some ways to provide some kind of offense, right? Jizzle James has been averaging 20 shots a game for the last 3 to 4 games. Day Thomas has seen his role and his minutes increase. But another thing that really hampers this team, Russ, is the injury to Connor Hickman, right? They really desperately needed a third ball handler. And Connor Hickman was supposed to be that guy that can come in, give you 15 to 18 minutes a game, get you some points off the bench. But overall, outside Jizzle James and Day Thomas, their offense is struggling. And in this one, Russ, as you mentioned, Day Thomas only played 20 minutes but finished with 19 points in what could have been his best game of his young career if he would have stayed out of foul trouble. If he was out of foul trouble, I think this game really goes a different way. Could have been a lot closer, especially since Wes Miller said Day Thomas had the LJ Cryer assignment in this contest, who LJ Cryer finished with 20 points in this one, led all of Houston 7-13. Overall, I think if Day Thomas's ability to stay on the court and play those closer to those 30 minutes and stay out of foul trouble, I don't think we see LJ Cryer get 20 points. I think we see him get maybe 12 to 14, but that could be a huge different category in this one.
Right, they got him in foul trouble. They got Josh Reed in the foul trouble, and that's just what good teams do, Neil. They pick on your guys that you need the most, and they put them in awkward and unenviable situations. Josh Reed, a little bit of come down to earth for him in this game. 1 of 3 shooting, 4 points, 2 rebounds, did have the 4 personal fouls, as mentioned, along with 4 for Day Thomas. Cincinnati commits 17 fouls in this game. They just an uncharacteristic day with the whistle, and that's what great teams do. They get you out of what you do best. They make you uncomfortable, and that's what Houston did. I mean, it's not a crazy shocking result. Neil and I both had the Bearcats losing this game, and now you're left with still needing to get basically to the 21 to 22 win mark. 22 wins, I think, would be hard to keep Cincinnati out of the NCAA tournament with them sitting at 17 wins right now. So that would be a 3-game run in the Big 12 tournament. I think that would be enough to get them through, especially with what we've seen on the bubble. I mean, people might have come away from that game and thought, oh, they had to win out. They had to find a way to get to 500 in the Big 12 in the regular season. The season's over. Not so fast. Even losing a 12th consecutive game to Houston is not put an official driven nail through the coffin of the Bearcats at large hopes. We'll get to those numbers after these messages on Bearcat Blitz, presented by Bet Online. Neil, more of the same against Houston. Obviously, it was just the UC's depth at this point in the season, as you laid out astutely in your kind of monologue segment response there. They're too far gone at this point to be able to realistically beat a team like Houston, especially on the road. But they should be able to realistically beat another banged up team in Kansas State coming up. And you'd think with how well they played down the stretch of this conference slate, go into Oklahoma State and take out one of the worst teams in the Big 12 there. If they do that, Neil, they get to 19 wins on the season, and you go into the Big 12 tournament as a likely 10 or 11 seed, most likely the 10 seed in that scenario. There is a path for Cincinnati to win a few games. I think 3 is the marker to get to. If they can get to 3, they're going to leave no doubt, in my opinion, that they should be in the NCAA tournament because of what happened on Saturday, Neil. I mean, they had a ton of bubble teams break with losses Cincinnati's way, and it allowed them to lose a game by 9 points on the road and go from 47th in the net rankings to number 40 in the net rankings, one of their highest marks in a long time. I believe it is their highest ranking in the net since all the way back in January 20th. January 20th was the last time they were inside the top 40 in the net rankings. That's huge for Cincinnati, Neil. It's been huge how many bubble teams have been losing around them and ultimately maybe leaving the committee with no choice but to put a team that is 1-10, yes, in quad 1 games this season into the dance, but also is 9-2 in quad 2, 1-0 in quad 3, has passed the test plenty of times at that next tier level of competition.
Yeah, absolutely, Russ. And I mean, you look down at the way this conference in the bubble has really kind of formed after this past weekend. I mean, Xavier has a couple big wins as of late. They've been playing some good basketball, but overall, look at the way this bubble has gone. Dayton hasn't been performing well. Indiana's starting to come back into the mix of things. Cincinnati climbs to number 40th in the net despite losing at Houston. And Russ, I know you and I have talked about it a couple times. Bart Torvik had this team sitting at 12% to make the NCAA tournament just a couple weeks ago. And right now they're sitting close to 40% following the loss to Houston. So the way this bubble is forming out, if Cincinnati is able to go in, beat Kansas State on Wednesday night, then go on the road and beat Oklahoma State and somehow secures a 10 seed, that would be much better than playing. You say you fall one of these 2 games and you get the 12 seed, potentially 12 and 13 seed play at Tuesday at 11:30 a.m. out there in Kansas City. But overall, Russ, it's also worth noting too that I believe Cincinnati, after Cincinnati's game versus Oklahoma State, if I remember right from talking with our conversations with David Cohen, the SID, Cincinnati plans to fly back home after Oklahoma State instead of going right to Kansas City. So with all that, that kind of means that they're looking to win these next 2 games. That way they don't have to go right to Kansas City and prepare for an early matinee matchup out there in conference tournament. But like you mentioned too, Russ, with the way this Big 12 kind of has been performing as of late, Cincinnati is capable, if they're able to go get that 10 seed, they're capable of making a run in the Big 12 tournament, to say the least, especially with how teams have been performing as of late. The Big 12 tournament, we saw it last year firsthand, Russ. If they're able to make a run like they did last year and get 2 or 3 of those games in conference tournament, this team might be a solidified lock for the NCAA tournament if they are able to accomplish such that.
Yeah, looking at about 34% chance to make the tournament as of right now on ESPN and their metric, and 35.8% on Bart Torvik, as Neil mentioned. That was down to about, in the teen percentage-wise when we were talking this time last week. So not really much has been done by Cincinnati outside of the high Q2 win against Baylor. Then they go and follow it with the Q1 loss against Houston. But so much carnage has been happening on the bubble around them that maybe, just maybe, I think it's going to take 3 wins, but it could only take 2. I wouldn't be shocked if Cincinnati only won 2 games in the Big 12 tournament after winning these next 2 games and ultimately got in with 21 wins on the season. It's going to take multiple wins in the Big 12 tournament at this point, though. I don't think they can just notch a Q3 win against one of these lower tiered first day opponents and then get it done. Once again, though, Neil, I wouldn't get it's tentative. It's still very tentative. Had they beat Houston, they probably could have just won these next 2 and not had to win any multiple game scenario to get into the ultimate dance NCAA tournament wise. And they still have to go and do something that they have never done, which is win consecutive games, 4 of those at least in conference play. 2 of those going to be back-to-back fashion when you think about having to play on consecutive days throughout the throughout the Big 12 tournament. And they might have to get 5 in a row, which they've never won 3 games in the Big 12 tournament. Obviously, I've only had one opportunity to do so last year, getting the job done. Well, they won the first game, right, Neil, over Kansas, and then lost to Baylor in the second game.
They beat West Virginia in round 1, then they beat Kansas, and then they lost to Baylor.
There you go. So they won 2 games last year. Might be enough to repeat that and get into the dance in 2025. We shall see how things play out in and around the bubble for Cincinnati over the next few days. It's not necessarily like they got vaulted right into those spots left vacant by some of the teams that have lost. Still only on 1 bracket across the Bracket Project's 2025 matrix out of about 85 confirmed brackets right now. We'll see what the latest update looks like ahead of the matchup against Kansas State on Wednesday, as many brackets get updated in the midst of or after we're done recording this show at the start of the week on Monday. Neil Meyer, Russ Heltman with you all, previewing the Kansas State matchup at home for the Bearcats on Wednesday night, right after this. Bearcat Blitz rolls on into our final segment here as Cincinnati still plenty to fight for, plenty to play for on the at-large bubble, with all these teams losing around them, including a Kansas State team that has floundered in recent weeks without its star player, Coleman Hawkins, who's been out for the last few games due to a knee injury, and Kansas State has lost 4 of its past 5, did break a 4-game losing streak against Colorado at home, 65-56 over the weekend. But Neil, this is the one that got away from Cincinnati, this game and the loss to Utah. 2 games where, had they won earlier in the season, they'd be sitting pretty and maybe in a win it in scenario right now if they were to have swept Kansas State. But back in another revenge spot, having to avenge a rough loss earlier in the season. And Neil, if they don't have Coleman Hawkins, I'm just struggling to understand how we're going to get a game in the 70s here, how we're going to see the Kansas State offense, and we'll start there, up against Cincinnati's defense, do a whole lot of destructive things. Because if you can't pull out Cincinnati's front court with Aziz Bandaogo and Dylan Mitchell to have to defend the 3, we've seen them, and Saturday was another good example of being able to defend the 3 ball really well without a stretch 5 aspect and make things hard on a litany of players to get to the basket and ultimately stay efficient. Houston was able to do that. They shot 53.8% from the field, or 53.6% from the field. But this is a much less efficient Kansas State offense, a much poorer Kansas State offense, and a Kansas State offense that I think Cincinnati, with where they are, even with where they are health-wise, banged up, just like Kansas State. If the Wildcats don't have Coleman Hawkins, even with him coming back from his first game after a knee injury, a banged up, a limited hold Coleman Hawkins, anything of that sort, it's going to make it really difficult to get into the mid-60s or even the 70s for the Kansas State Wildcats.
Yeah, Russ, and I think that's too worth noting that Kansas State has only been into the 70s one time since Coleman Hawkins left with the injury, and that was the UCF game. So overall, this Kansas State team, if they don't have Coleman Hawkins, I think everybody kind of knows Coleman Hawkins was their guy coming into the season. And Russ, throw it back to late December, right? Kansas State saw Coleman Hawkins' best game of the season come against who other than Cincinnati, right? Finished with 20 points, 10 rebounds on 7 of 13 shooting in that matchup. That was the matchup where Cincinnati arguably, if Cincinnati got that win earlier in the conference slate, Russ, we're going to be talking about a much different scenario here, more than likely, but in terms of the NCAA tournament run. However, Coleman Hawkins unable to go is a huge thing for Kansas State, because you look down, Coleman Hawkins is 6'10", 6'11". He is that big power forward kind of stretch 4 that can do so much for the Wildcats and Jerome Tang's squad up there. But overall, this matchup, if I'm Cincinnati, I'm going to be pretty frustrated heading into this matchup with Kansas State, especially being in Cincinnati, especially after what happened back in December. I mean, you were up in that game, then you end up losing a very close game in a game you were projected to win. And that kind of started the conference slate, right? You go 0-4 in that matchup, or 0-4 in that stretch, and you put yourself in a hole following the first matchup. But Coleman Hawkins is everything for Kansas State. They're going to rely on guys like Doug McDaniel, David Ngusson to kind of fill that void. But Russ, what's also noted about this matchup, the first matchup, if you look back and you really kind of remember this game, who was Cincinnati's lead scorer in that matchup? Dan Skillings. 18 points, just 2 rebounds in that matchup, 7 for 15 shooting. Could this be a game where he comes in and makes an impact? I don't know. But it is something to keep an eye on, considering how much success he had in Manhattan back in December.
I would be shocked if we get that out of Dan Skillings, just the way the offense and the whole team has moved away from him since that point. But crazier things would happen, and it would be fantastic for Cincinnati just to get either him or Seamus Lukoshis going, because there's not really many more reinforcements they can call on, especially shooting the ball wise and offensively, that they can tap into here with where the roster is health wise at this point in the season. And Neil, like, if Cincinnati can rebound the way that they did against Houston, which that was one of the more impressive things they did, out rebounding the Cougars, one of the best rebounding teams in the country, 32-28. If they put up 35, 36, 37 rebounds, I don't see how Kansas State's going to even come close to competing with that. They have a negative rebounding differential in conference play right now, giving up 33.4 to just 29.4 on their end. 33.4 rebounds allowed. That's 13th out of 16 teams in the entire conference. I think that's the best way for Cincinnati to ultimately overcome some really good three-point defense out of the Cougars. They're one of the best three-point defenses in the conference, allowing just 30.6% from deep this season, and they don't allow a ton of free throws. So Cincinnati, I think, should be pretty aggressive trying to get the ball to the basket, but if the jump shot is hitting, if the mid-range jumper is starting to hit early on and they feel like they can flow into that, then use it for sure. But keep the same kind of mentality, hit the glass really hard, try to get those put-back opportunities back up quickly near the rim, get David Ngusson into foul trouble. If they can do that, then they can be really, really home free here. When you think about a guy who's second on the team, averages the second most fouls on the team, 29 minutes per game for Ngusson, 62.4% shooting this season. That's number 1 in the Big 12. He's one of the most efficient post scorers in the entire conference as we kind of shift from the offensive side of the ball for Cincinnati to defending the Kansas State Wildcats. It's going to come down to, can they slow down the McDaniel and Ngusson pick and roll? Can they keep Doug McDaniel from completely dicing them up, averaging 4.9 assists, 11.1 points, but only shooting 38% from the floor? You want McDaniel to be the shooter. You want to give more attention to Ngusson when he's rolling down the lane. And honestly, you may not have to give a ton of extra attention to him, given how well Aziz Bandaogo has been playing defensively of late over the last couple of games. So to me, there's just not enough talent. There's not enough overwhelming force for Kansas State to really think they're going to have much of an issue with the Wildcats in this game, that being the Bearcats, that is. And they just have not gone on the road very well at all this season, Neil. 2-9 on the road, Kansas State is on the campaign. They have just ultimately not brought their best actions, brought their best intensity on the road, and especially this long of a road trip, this far of a road trip, facing a 12-4 Cincinnati team at home in the 2024-25 campaign. Give me the Bearcats 73-63 in a game that never really feels like it's ever in much doubt. What do you got?
Yeah, Russ, I'm right there with you. I think this is going to be a double-digit win for Cincinnati. I'm going to go 75-64. And the reason I say that is because, like you mentioned, Coleman Hawkins maybe not being able to go is a huge thing. And Russ, you mentioning the rebounding battle, right? Cincinnati won the rebounding margin by 6 the first time out in Manhattan. If they are able to do so here again, and you can keep that rebounding margin plus 10 or so, maybe +6 without Coleman Hawkins. That 6 to 10 range, if you can win the margin by that much, you should be able to win this game. And especially with how Cincinnati has played at home over the last few games compared to what Kansas State has done on the road, just 2-9, like you mentioned. This is a huge opportunity for Cincinnati. And not only that, but it's the last opportunity. It's going to be senior day. There's going to be a lot of seniors walking. I think Fifth Third's crowd will play a factor. But overall, I don't see Kansas State really having much of an opportunity there unless some magical run happens. However, being without Coleman Hawkins, one of your key forces there, who does so much for that team, I don't think there's a chance that Kansas State wins this game. I'm going to go 75-64 in favor of the Bearcats.
Neil and I both rolling with Cincinnati. I'm trying to get to 25-5. It would be on the season if the Bearcats can pull off the victory. We both nailed the Houston projection. We'll see if we can keep it going here on Bearcat Blitz. 23-5 on my picks so far this season. Very proud of that. As we wrap up the show here, presented by Bet Online. Hope you all enjoy the rest of your week. Enjoy the Bearcats action. And we'll be back after the Kansas State's results to see where the Bearcats sit entering the final game of the regular season at Oklahoma State this weekend. Enjoy the week, everybody. Have a good one.
This is the second. 15 seconds left. Shot clock off. 4-point game. DeJulius puts up a three. And a goal!
3 seconds left.